The Quran affirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the gospel. And yet, our Muslim friends tell us that the gospel has been corrupted. And no matter how many times I show our Muslim friends what the Quran really says, no matter how many times I challenge them to show me a single Quran verse that says the gospel has been corrupted, they continue insisting that the Quran says something completely different from what it actually says. Since they haven't read the Quran, they always seem to assume that there must be some verse somewhere in the Quran that says the gospel has been corrupted because that's what their sheikhs and imams tell them it says. Fortunately, there is a way for all of us to finally get to the bottom of this. There is a way to settle this dispute and see who's right and who's been duped by lying sheikhs and imams. In this video, we're going to read every single verse in the Quran that mentions the gospel. If you're watching this and you're a Muslim, you're about to learn way more about what the Quran says about the gospel than your sheikhs and imams will ever tell you. They do not want you to know this, so they hide it from you. If you're watching this and you're a non-Muslim, you're about to have some awesome material for some very interesting conversations with your Muslim friends. You're about to go from beginner to expert level. Now, to ensure careful reasoning as we go through these verses, let's set up two hypotheses here at the beginning, and then we'll go through the Quran and see which hypothesis is confirmed by the evidence. My hypothesis, we'll call it the D. Wood hypothesis, is this. According to the Quran, Allah gave different revelations to different groups of people through different prophets, and those different groups are responsible for obeying the scriptures that were revealed to them. Christians received the gospel through Jesus. The gospel is still reliable and authoritative, and Christians are commanded to judge by the gospel, not by the Quran. That's the D. Wood hypothesis. If the D. Wood hypothesis is correct, Muslims face two major problems. First, the Quran sounds like it's saying that Allah gave a book called the Gospel to Jesus, and that Jesus then gave this book to his followers. But the Quran says that Christians still have the Gospel, and that Christians have to judge by the Gospel. Since Christians have never had a book that was given by Jesus, Allah apparently doesn't know what he's talking about. Second, in the Quran, Allah really seems to think that the gospel that Christians still have agrees with the Quran, when it clearly doesn't. Since Allah affirms our scriptures when our scriptures contradict the Quran, Allah once again doesn't know what he's talking about. So, that's my hypothesis, and those are the two main problems for Islam if my hypothesis is correct. Then there's the Muslim hypothesis. We'll call it the standard Islamic narrative. The standard Islamic narrative is this. According to the Quran, Allah gave different revelations to different groups of people, but they were all corrupted except the Quran. Christians received the gospel through Jesus, but they corrupted it. The gospel is not reliable or authoritative, and Christians must now judge by the Quran, not by the gospel. That is what you believe, isn't it, my Muslim friends? That is what your sheikhs and imams tell you, isn't it? There's just one problem for the standard Islamic narrative: the Quran. Let's go through the Quran and read every single verse that mentions the gospel so we can see which hypothesis is correct. Now, there are only 12 verses that mention the gospel. If you're taking notes, the verses are Surah 3, verse 3, Surah 3, verse 48, Surah 3, verse 65, Surah 5, verse 46, Surah 5, verse 47, Surah 5, verse 66, Surah 5, verse 68, Surah 5, verse 110, Surah 7, verse 157, Surah 9, verse 111, Surah 48, verse 29, and Surah 57, verse 27. Some of these verses are perfectly clear on their own, so we can read those on their own. Some of the verses require a bit of context. For those, we'll read some of the surrounding context. All right, let's confirm a hypothesis and disconfirm another hypothesis. First up, Surah 3, verse 3. We'll read verses 2 through 4 for context. God, there is no God but He, the living, the self-subsisting. He sent down the book upon thee, upon Muhammad, in truth, confirming what was before it. So the Quran confirms what came before it. And He sent down the Torah and the Gospel aforetime as a guidance to mankind. And He sent down the criterion, truly those who disbelieve in the signs of God shall have a severe punishment, and God is mighty, possessor of vengeance. There are a few interesting pieces of evidence here. Surah 3, verse 3 obviously affirms the inspiration of the gospel. It says that Allah sent down the Torah and the gospel.
Faster than you could say mental hospitals, disabled kids, and hammers, David Wood keeps bringing up one of the most annoying arguments against Islam, which is that the Quran allegedly affirms the New Testament or the Gospel. So basically, notice what David Wood said. He said that the Quran, he says that there's two hypotheses, and he wants to show that his hypothesis is correct. Now, the problem here is that David Wood is correct on one point. He's correct that the gospel is mentioned in the Quran 12 times. That's true. I mean, no Muslim is denying that. But the problem with these Christians is that they don't understand what the Quran means when it's talking about the gospel. Notice what the Quran is saying. The Quran chapter 3 verse 3 is saying that the gospel was revealed to Jesus. Now, what do we have in today's Bible, in today's New Testament? The New Testament is 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. None of these are the gospel of Jesus. The gospel of Jesus is what the Quran, or when the Quran's talking about the gospel, it's talking about the gospel revealed to Jesus, not necessarily in a book form. Nowhere in the Quran does it say Jesus wrote down the gospel. It just says the gospel was revealed to Jesus. So what that means is that the Quran is affirming that a revelation called the gospel was sent down to Jesus. Not the New Testament, not the gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the gospel of Jesus. And all I have to do to support this is just cite a few Quranic verses. Quran chapter 5 verse 46. It says, "And we caused Jesus the son of Mary to follow in their footsteps, confirming what was revealed before him in the Torah, and and this is the important part, and we, which is Allah, bestowed on him the gospel, wherein is guidance and light, confirming that which was revealed before it in the Torah." Now, let's just focus on the gospel and not on the Torah. Now notice what the Quran chapter 5 verse 46 says. We bestowed on Jesus the gospel. So Allah revealed the gospel to Jesus. He didn't reveal the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 4 different gospels with 4 different theological inputs. He revealed a revelation to Jesus, and that revelation was probably not written down by Jesus, since there's no evidence that Jesus wrote down anything when he was on earth. Another verse to support this is the Quran chapter 50. It's the Quran chapter 57:27. The Quran chapter 57 verse 27. It says, "We caused Jesus the son of Mary to follow, and we gave him the gospel." So notice what the Quran chapter 57 verse 27 is saying. We gave Jesus the gospel. What that means is that Allah revealed a revelation to Jesus, and that revelation is, the gospel. That's not the New Testament, you see, because the New Testament composes of 4 gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which teach the crucifixion or the death and resurrection of Jesus. What does the Quran say about the crucifixion, or what does the Quran say about the death of Jesus? The Quran says in chapter 4 verse 157 they didn't kill Jesus, nor did they crucify him. It just looked like they did. And those who believe he was, crucified or killed are following nothing but conjecture, for surely they killed him not. Quran chapter 4, verse 157. Now, pay attention to the last part, what the Quran is saying. The Quran is saying those who follow or those who believe in the crucifixion of the death and crucifixion of Jesus are following conjecture and corruption. So the Quran chapter 4 verse 157 in a direct and indirect way is saying that the New Testament, which teaches that the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus is a corruption according to Quranic theology. Now, whether the Quran's claim is correct or not, that's a separate issue. But correct Quranic theology has always been that the gospel was revealed to Jesus, not the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So this is a very easy point to refute. Another problem is that what the early Muslim scholars like Ibn Kathir, Ibn Hazm, Ibn Qayyum, Al-Tabari, Ibn Abbas, all these early Muslim scholars believe that the Jews and Christians have corrupted the scriptures. And when the Quran mentions the gospel, according to Ibn Kathir, who is a very important Quranic commentator who incorporated early material into his material, says when the Quran's mentioning the gospel, it's talking about the prophecies of Muhammad in the gospel. So, when Allah revealed the gospel, there was prophecies of Prophet Muhammad, and the Christians have to ignore their previous scripture because it's outdated, it's done, and Muhammad needs to be followed now according to Quranic theology. So, so that's the point of the gospel. That's one of the points of the gospel, to follow Muhammad. We don't find Prophet Muhammad in the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We don't find him in there because he was prophesied in the gospel revealed to Jesus, or the revelation of Jesus, and not the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are 4 different books which came after Jesus and which contain teachings that don't necessarily conform to what Jesus actually said and taught. So all you got to do is read what the Quran is actually saying. It's talking about a revealed gospel and not a written gospel, a revealed gospel to Jesus. Every scholar, whether they're atheist or Christian, agree that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written after Jesus. Jesus died, according to, atheists and Christians, and then the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written. The gospel that was revealed to Jesus, whether it was an oral revelation or a written, or whether Jesus wrote his gospel, that gospel is lost and destroyed, as even Christian scholars admit that Jesus never wrote down anything. He probably didn't write down anything, according to Christian scholarship. So when the Quran is talking about a revelation that Allah revealed the gospel to Jesus, according to the Quran chapter 3 verse 3, and the Quran chapter 5 verse 46, and the Quran chapter 57 verse 27, when the Quran's talking about a revealed revelation to Jesus, which is called the gospel, that gospel is lost. I think that's the better term. Not instead of corrupted, let's just say it's lost. And the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not reflect that original gospel that was revealed to Jesus. Thus, the Quran is not in any way confirming the Bible or confirming the New Testament, because the New Testament came, or the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John came after Jesus, and Jesus never wrote down anything. So that's a very easy it's a very easy thing to refute what he's saying. Another problem is if you read the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, like I just said, and Quran chapter 5, verse 13 through 15, Quran chapter 2, verse 75, Quran chapter 2, verse 79, etc., etc. If you read these verses, it's clear the Quran is clearly talking about how the Jews and Christians have corrupted their scriptures. What was the scripture at the time of the Prophet Muhammad? The Old Testament, from Genesis to Malachi. and the New Testament, from Matthew to the book of Revelations. So that's today's current Old Testament canon and the New Testament canon, or the Protestant, these Protestant versions, because the Old Testament was canonized at least 100 years before Jesus, and the New Testament was canonized at least 300 years before the Prophet Muhammad was born. So that means when the Quran is accusing the Jews and Christians of corrupting their scriptures, and when Ibn Kathir is saying the same thing in his commentary on the Quran, it means that the Old Testament and New Testaments were corrupted during, before the Prophet Muhammad's time. And the Quran is saying that the Quran needs to be followed by everybody, according to the Quran, chapter 2, verse 185, etc., etc. So that's correct Quranic theology, and that the Gospel and the Torah has prophesied the Prophet Muhammad, according to Tafsir ibn Kathir, Ibn Abbas' commentary, etc. And, now the Torah and Gospel, the Torah revealed to Moses and the Gospel revealed to Jesus is now outdated and done. And now the Christians and Jews have to follow the Prophet Muhammad, because according to the Quran, the Torah and the Gospel predicted the coming of the Prophet Muhammad. So that's correct Quranic theology. According to the Quran, chapter 61, I believe, Jesus prophesied that Prophet Muhammad would come. So where is this prophecy in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? It's not there. So what that means is that Jesus foretold the coming of Ahmad, or the Prophet Muhammad, in his original revealed gospel, as the Quran chapter 3 verse 3 says. And so that's further proof that this gospel is lost over time, and that the gospel contained information about the coming of the Prophet Muhammad, and he needs to be followed now. So that's correct Quranic theology. So you just got to do a little bit of, careful reading of what the Quran is saying. When these Christians say, well, the Quran's talking about the gospel, yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm not denying, nobody's denying that. But but read what the Quran is actually saying. It's talking about a revealed gospel. It's not talking about a written gospel. It's talking about a revealed gospel to Jesus. That the gospel of Jesus is not the gospel of Matthew. It's not the gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or Acts of the Apostles, or 1 Timothy, or Revelation, or Romans, or, that's not what it is. It's the gospel of Jesus, not the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So thus, the Quran is not confirming the New Testament, and it's not confirming the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's confirming a revelation given to Jesus, which is lost over time. So I think corrupted is not the appropriate word to describe what happened to the Gospel according to the Quran. According to the Quran, there was a revealed gospel to Jesus, but that gospel is lost over time. Has been lost over time, and in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not reflect that original gospel of Jesus. Rather, it reflects the views of whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, probably a second generation of Christians living after the time of Jesus. So this is just my thoughts on the whole the Quran and the gospel thing. When these Christians say, the gospel, there's, gospel in the Quran, what is the Quran talking about when it's talking about the gospel? Well, it's talking about a revealed gospel to Jesus. That's not the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you just need to know a little bit of common sense and a little bit of, the origin of the New Testament to refute this claim. Nowhere in the New Testament is there a separate book called the Gospel of Jesus. No. What we have in the New Testament is the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which is not the Gospel of Jesus, but rather the gospel according to the second generation of believers who came after Jesus, who came after the disciples, who are writing in a language that Jesus didn't even speak. Jesus never spoke Greek. He spoke Aramaic. Yet the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are written in Greek. Further evidence that the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were writing in a different country, in a different culture, in a different context, using the Old Testament, to tell the story of Jesus, which is which is, you know, a perversion, or which is different from what the gospel that Jesus was teaching. So, you know, so you just got to do a little bit of research into what the New Testament, or where the New Testament arose, or where it came from, to know that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are definitely not the Gospel of Jesus. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are rewritten Old Testament works, and which rely on the Old Testament and the Old Testament Apocrypha, and rely on unknown sources to talk about the life of Jesus, which doesn't reflect the revealed gospel to Jesus, as the Quran chapter 3 verse 3 talks about. So this is just my 2 cents on this whole issue. If you want the verses that clearly talk about the corruption of, you know, the Bible, or you want the Quranic verses that talk about the corruption of what we would call in the, you know, today's Bible, it would be the Quran chapter 2 verse 75, Quran chapter 2 verse 79, Quran chapter 4 verse 157, and Quran chapter 5 verse 13 through 15. These verses clearly talk about how the Jews and Christians have corrupted their scriptures, and how they're following conjecture. And the fact of the matter is that, according to Quranic theology, the Jews and Christians have corrupted their scriptures, and that means that the Old Testament and New Testament is corrupt, or edited, or altered according to Quranic theology, and the evidence bears that out. You know, I'm not going to get into how, you know, the Old Testament and New Testament was corrupted, or altered, or changed, or was written anonymously here, but you get my point. My point is that the Quran does not affirm the Bible, or today's Bible, in any way, shape, or form. You just got to read the Quran carefully to realize when the Quran's talking about a revealed Torah and a revealed gospel, it's talking about a revelation given to Moses and a revelation given to Jesus, which is not today's Old Testament and New Testaments, which was written after Moses and was written after Jesus. Stay tuned for more videos.